Right now, at this exact moment, the President of the United States has turned semiconductors into a national security tariff line with a 25% Section 232 hit. That is not a policy memo. That is a price shock wired directly into the nervous system of the global economy. One signature turns every chip, quote, every contract renewal, and every supply forecast into a panic math problem. Semiconductors are not a single industry. They are a stacked chain of promises. Design tools feed design houses. Design houses feed foundries. Foundries feed packaging. Packaging feeds servers, phones, cars, factory robots, and weapon systems. When the price of one layer jumps, the whole stack does not absorb it. It transmits it. This is not speculation. This is pattern recognition. The technology sovereignty collapse pattern has repeated across industries and decades without exception. The timeline varies. The sequence does not. Dominance turns into good enough. Good enough turns into decoupling. Decoupling turns into permanent share loss. Every single time, without exception. In the next 10 minutes, the mechanism becomes obvious. You will see how a tariff and quota design forces reshoring capital spending, squeezes corporate margins, pushes prices downstream, triggers a capex boom, flips into a capex bust, and ends in a layoff cycle that hits long before the public understands why. You will see how the United States loses memory chip dominance to Japan, how clean energy manufacturing turns into a tariff-driven whiplash trap, and how a single export control date rewires an entire technology ecosystem. Then you will see why January 15, 2026 matches the pattern down to the mechanics that hit your tech index exposure, your consumer electronics prices, and your AI infrastructure costs within 12 months. Here is the mechanism. Watch the sequence, because this is how technology empires fracture. There are 4 stages. Each one is predictable. Each one is measurable. Each one has happened before. Stage 1 is dominance and trust. A country leads on quality, scale, and cost. Buyers standardize. Suppliers cluster. The ecosystem feels permanent. Success becomes a baseline assumption. Stage 2 is good enough and overextension. The leader optimizes yesterday's advantage. Accounting rewards buybacks and margin instead of redundancy and capacity. Competitors copy the product, then the process, then the supply chain. The system stretches because demand keeps rising, and nobody gets punished for fragility during the good years. Stage 3 is decoupling and the crack. A rule changes, a tariff hits, a license is revoked, a quota draws a hard line through what used to be a smooth global flow. The cost of the same chip changes depending on which side of a border it crosses. Inventory gets hoarded, orders double, lead times explode. The system snaps at its weakest link. Stage 4 is permanent share loss and reset. Production relocates, but not instantly. In the gap, buyers redesign away from the constrained supply. New suppliers become the default. Capital gets stranded, layoffs hit, the ecosystem consolidates, and the leader discovers that sovereignty is not something you declare. It is something you finance continuously. This pattern does not care about speeches. It does not care about good intentions. It does not care about which party holds power. It only cares about one mechanical truth. When you force a complex supply chain to move faster than physics and faster than cash flow, it breaks, and the replacement becomes permanent. First case study. The United States and Japan, memory chips. The moment when dominance turns into good enough and never returns. Stage 1 is dominance and trust. In the 1970s, American firms sit at the center of commercial semiconductors. They build the know-how, the tooling culture, the customer relationships, the standards. Buyers trust the pipeline. The industry feels like an American home game. Stage 2 is good enough and overextension. By the early 1980s, the market rewards scale, flawless yield, and relentless cost reduction. Japanese firms treat manufacturing like a national project. Process discipline becomes the product. The United States still innovates, but the center of gravity shifts from invention to execution. The leader assumes its advantage is permanent. That is the good enough trap. Stage 3 arrives on schedule, on a calendar date you can point to. September 22, 1985. The Plaza Accord hits, currencies realign, and price competition gets rewritten overnight. Then July 31, 1986, the US-Japan Semiconductor Agreement lands as an attempt to manage trade and market access. In the same window, buyers do what buyers always do when uncertainty rises. They standardize on the supplier that delivers on time, at scale, with predictable quality. That is not patriotism. That is procurement. Japanese manufacturers surge. American memory producers get squeezed between falling prices and rising capital intensity. They cut, they merge, they exit. Capacity does not disappear, it moves. Stage 4 is permanent share loss and reset. Once buyers shift their designs and supplier qualification pipelines, the old leader does not just win back share with a better chip. It has to rebuild the ecosystem that made share possible. The pattern completes. Dominance turns into dependence. The timeline varies. The sequence does not. Every single time, without exception. Second case study. Modern manufacturing whiplash. Tariffs, forced localization, and the boom-bust that empties factories. Stage 1 is dominance and trust. A technology becomes strategic, demand surges, and the early leaders build the playbook. Suppliers cluster, banks lend, governments celebrate jobs and ribbon cuttings. The industry builds capacity under the assumption that demand growth is a straight line. Stage 2 is good enough and overextension. Competitors learn fast. Production becomes commoditized, margins thin. To stay alive, companies chase scale. They borrow to build. They sign long purchase commitments. They book future profits as if they are guaranteed. The system stretches because everyone believes they must grow or die. Stage 3 arrives on schedule, on a calendar date you can point to. August 31, 2011, Solyndra files for bankruptcy. Not because clean energy disappears, but because cost curves and policy curves collide. Then the tariff era intensifies. Trade barriers slam into a supply chain built for global optimization. The moment a tariff wall rises, firms do not become sovereign. They become stressed. Projects get pulled forward to beat deadlines. Inventory is built in advance. Orders spike. Then the pull forward ends and the cliff arrives. Prices do not settle gently. They gap. Financing tightens. Capacity that looked essential on the way up becomes excess on the way down. Stage 4 is permanent share loss and reset. The winners are not the companies with the best press release. The winners are the ecosystems that can survive the down cycle without losing their workforce and their suppliers. The losers learn the same lesson the hard way. Once customers redesign their purchasing plans around a new geography, the old geography stops being the default. The pattern is absolute. The timeline varies. The sequence does not. Third case study. Decoupling by decree. One date, one list, a global redesign. Stage 1 is dominance and trust. For years, the global tech stack behaves like one machine. Chips flow across borders. Software updates travel at the speed of light. Phones, routers, servers, and base stations share common components and common design tools. The system feels inevitable. Stage 2 is good enough and overextension. Companies optimize for cost and speed. They single-source critical components because the supplier is reliable. They build products that assume the global market remains open. They treat access as a law of nature. That is the overextension. Stage 3 arrives on schedule, on a calendar date you can point to. May 15, 2019. Huawei is added to the US Entity List. Overnight, what used to be a commercial supply chain becomes a permissioned system. Buyers and sellers respond with mechanical logic. Companies stockpile. Orders surge. Warehouses fill. Then the real shift begins. Engineers redesign to remove dependencies. Suppliers build alternatives. Entire product lines get requalified with new components and new software layers. This is decoupling in action. It does not feel like a single event. It feels like 1,000 small substitutions. That is why it becomes permanent. Stage 4 is permanent share loss and reset. The old integrated system does not come back. The world splits into stacks. Once that split becomes operational, it becomes the new normal. The pattern completes itself every single time, without exception. Now bring it to the present. January 14, 2026. A proclamation is issued to adjust semiconductor imports. January 15, 2026. The 25% tariff becomes effective. On the same date, a U.S.-Taiwan deal is reported, tied to a $250 billion Taiwan-linked U.S. chip investment pledge. That is not coincidence. That is Stage 3 timing. Stage 1 is dominance and trust. For decades, the semiconductor system globalizes around efficiency. The United States leads on design, tools, and capital markets. East Asia leads on manufacturing density and speed. Taiwan becomes the foundry core because it executes at scale with unmatched consistency. The system works, so everyone builds on top of it. Stage 2 is good enough and overextension. Over the last 5 years, demand for compute explodes. AI training clusters grow, data centers multiply, cars absorb chips that used to be optional. At the same time, the industry locks itself into long lead time tools, specialized chemicals, and tight packaging capacity. Profit targets push companies to run lean. Inventory buffers shrink because lean looks smart until lean becomes fragile. Capital spending becomes cyclical because investors reward efficiency more than resilience. That is how a strategic supply chain becomes a just-in-time wager. Stage 3 is the crack, and it begins with tariff and quota mechanics that corporations cannot negotiate away. A 25% tariff does not land as a one-time penalty. It lands as a permanent wedge. If the policy includes quotas, the wedge becomes sharper because it creates two prices for the same chip, inside the quota and outside the quota. That structure forces behavior. Right now, today, at this moment, procurement teams rewrite contracts to shift who pays the tariff. Suppliers resist. Negotiations stall. Shipments get timed, delayed, or accelerated to fit new rules. That is the first signal. As of January 15, 2026, every imported chip tied to the tariff line carries a built-in margin fight. Either the chip maker eats it, the distributor eats it, the device maker eats it, or the consumer eats it. No one volunteers. That is the second signal. Currently, the reshoring mandate implied by the policy forces capital spending forward. Foundries, packaging firms, and equipment suppliers pull demand from the future into the present. That creates a capex boom. The boom is not a sign of health. It is a sign of constraint. That is the third signal. Right now, margins compress because domestic builds cost more before they cost less. New fabs burn cash. Yield ramps take time. The tariff hits immediately. The cost relief arrives later. That gap is where layoffs are born. That is the fourth signal. Today, downstream prices start moving. Consumer electronics do not get cheaper when the bill of materials rises. They get redesigned, downgraded, or repriced. Phones hold features constant and raise prices. Laptops hold prices constant and cut performance. Either way, the consumer pays. That is the fifth signal. Currently, AI infrastructure costs spike because advanced compute is the most sensitive to supply friction. If accelerator availability tightens, cloud pricing follows. When cloud pricing follows, startups slow hiring, enterprises pause projects, and the tech index reprices growth. That is the sixth signal. These are not isolated facts. They are Stage 3 signals. The pattern is repeating in real time. The semiconductor system is in Stage 3. Here is how you know. In the US-Japan memory era, currency and trade rules change and buyers standardize away from the stressed supplier. In the manufacturing whiplash era, tariffs pull demand forward, then collapse it, stranding capital and jobs. In the decoupling era, one date turns interoperability into redesign, and redesign becomes permanent. The match is precise. The timeline varies. The sequence does not. Stage 4 is coming. Here's what it looks like. In the short term, the next 12 months, the market absorbs the wedge through price pass-through and margin cuts. Device makers raise prices, cut features, or delay releases. Chip makers fight for exemptions and restructure product classifications. Distributors prioritize the highest margin parts, not the parts the economy needs most. In the medium term, the next 18 to 36 months, the capex boom becomes a capex bust. Projects that looked profitable under subsidized forecasts collide with real yields and real operating costs. Order books soften. Excess capacity appears in the wrong nodes while shortages persist in the right ones. That mismatch is where layoffs concentrate. Not because technology demand dies, but because capital was forced into timing that the market cannot smooth. In the long term, the reset becomes permanent. Buyers redesign supply chains to avoid tariff exposure. Product lines get qualified with alternative sources. Software stacks adapt to different hardware. Once that happens, share loss is not a temporary dip, it is a new baseline. The pattern is absolute, every single time, without exception. What this means for you is not abstract. If you are heavy in tech indexes, the margin compression and capex whiplash translate into drawdowns that arrive faster than headlines. If you buy consumer electronics, inflation shows up as higher prices, fewer features, or longer wait times. If your work depends on AI infrastructure, cost spikes show up as slower rollouts, tighter budgets, and delayed projects. This is not about panic. It is about preparation. When systems reset, paper forecasts fail. Real capacity, real inventory, and real delivery survive. The pattern has never been broken, not once, not ever. Be very clear about what is happening. Dominance and trust built the semiconductor age. Good enough and overextension hid fragility inside success. Decoupling and the crack have begun with a 25% tariff line effective January 15, 2026. Permanent share loss and reset come next. You can prepare for it or ignore it and hope this time is different. But remember this. This time is never different. The pattern is pattern. The timeline varies. The sequence does not. The United States loses memory leadership when the ecosystem shifts. Manufacturers get whipsawed when policy pulls demand forward and then drops it. Technology stacks split when decoupling forces redesign. Every single time, without exception. If this analysis opened your eyes, subscribe now. The semiconductor supply collapse mechanism is already in motion. Next time, the focus is the quota architecture and the hidden second-order effect that hits packaging and AI accelerators first. Comment below with one detail. Are you exposed through tech stocks, through the cost of devices, or through your company's AI spend? The pattern completes itself.